Everyone get out!
Hello tanks and tankettes, welcome to another review. There's been a bit of a gap since the last one and I do have a reason. I had intended to do the VK4502B, which would be fitting because you get the I've done the Tiger P, I've done the 4502A and I've done the mouse. So, you know, even though it would have been out of order, that's the one I wanted to do next. And then I was holding off because ages and ages ago Wargaming talked about giving it some buffs and then that never happened. And with the changes that they were talking about for 9.1, they were talking about doing a bunch of buffs and nerfs to a bunch of vehicles, and then they've decided to postpone that. And it looked like the VK4502B might be in that lot, but then again, it might not. It's kind of hard to tell, to be honest, because they seem to have changed their mind about this particular tank so many times. So that's why I've held off doing a review for so long. And the reason we're now seeing the Tortoise instead is partly because I really didn't have any other tanks where I had a suitable bit of a suitable replay to show you, because I'm quite fussy about the kind of replays that I use to go along with reviews. But then I had a particularly good game, the Tortoise. It's actually my ace tanker game that you're going to see later on in this review. And normally I don't use a game nearly that good, but it just showcases perfectly what the Torty is about. So it's basically because this good game came along and I thought, oh, okay, I can use that for a review of the Torty, because I've played enough battles in it to actually, I think, be able to impart some of what it's about. And you can see that I'm part of the way to the tier 10 as well, the F8-183. F8? What? The FV-183. Yeah. So the Torty, I'm starting off in the garage. I will switch over to Tank Inspector, but I'm starting off in the garage because I wanted to have a look at the model. And the model is, I mean, look at that. It's one of the HD models that was introduced into 9.0, and it does look really quite good. And it's, can you imagine all the tanks in game looking like this? I mean, it's going to be a slow process, but yeah, I think even though obviously it's going to be a big project for Wargaming to finish, I think it was a... Some would argue that maybe it ties up resources from other things, but it's the same people that are doing the models anyway. So given the number of tanks that are in the game at the moment, I for one have no objection to them slowing down the introduction of new tanks in order to make the existing tanks look better, because unfortunately first impressions count in games, and yeah, people are going to look at models like that and go, oh, that's World of Tanks, oh, I'm not going to play that. People are unfortunately that shallow, so if they hook in new people with prettier looking tanks, then okay, yes, it's a marketing thing, but I'm not going to complain about it too much because I think they look quite nice as well. So the Torty is the culmination of the Nuffield line of British tank destroyers, which starts at tier 5 with the 82, and then you get the 88, then the 87, 8015, and lastly the Torty. And the Torty looks most like the 8015 because the 8015 is kind of like the final paper design that led to the Torty. And you can see the similarity there. There's also the 8015A, which is the premium tank destroyer, but I'm not going to really talk about that because it's one of the worst tank destroyers and one of the worst premiums, and also it's not really a video about that, it's a video about this thing. And it is pretty much the ultimate expression of what Wargaming have decided to do with the British tank destroyer line, or just British guns generally, because they tend to go with kind of broad national characteristics, and not every tank within the national tech trees fits within those characteristics. But for the British, generally speaking, it's not so much about alpha damage, it's about rate of fire and DPM. And the Torty, like I've said, is like the ultimate expression of this. Now, of course, you get to the tier 10 and it's a total step change. You get what is, you know, direct fire artillery, KV2 on steroids, whatever you want to call it, the British Death Star. The FV-183 is totally ridiculous, and it's so different from this. So I like to say that the British tank destroyer line effectively has two tier 10 machines, because the Torty can easily hold its own in a tier 10 match with this gun, with the characteristics that it has. And if you're not particularly interested in the tier 10 in that playstyle, then you can quite happily just stop at the tier 9, and that's fine. You will happily be playing in tier 10 battles, but the thing is, you get better matchmaking than tier 10s. So, in some ways, this is actually a bit nicer than the tier 10, at least in terms of matchmaking. But in other ways, I don't know, maybe you've got the FV as the ultimate goal, in which case the Tortoise is not an unpleasant grind, but I suspect once you get to the tier 10, there's nothing really to prepare you for it from all the tanks that came prior to it, because it is just such a step change. But anyway, we're going to jump over into Tank Inspector now, and we'll actually look at the pros and cons of this thing, what actually makes it good, what its downsides are, and maybe try and give you some idea of how you should be playing it. So, I'm going to do my usual thing with this. I'm going to break it down into the pluses and minuses of the vehicle. The pluses is actually quite easy. It's all about the gun. It's the DPM, stupid, is one way to put it. I think I'm right in saying it's got the best DPM of any vehicle in-game, and it's all because of this L1A1 120mm cannon and the stats that it gets. I mean, obviously, you DPM, you think reload, and the reload is very good on this, but the other stats it's got going for it are good as well. It's not one of those ones where the DPM number's really good, but the penetration is lackluster or whatever. Some tanks have got like an excellent DPM figure, but then you actually look at how easy it is to pen another tank, and that's definitely not the case with the Tortoise. So, with no equipment at all and 100% crew, you get 3,525 DPM. With a gun rammer, that goes up to just under 4,000, that goes up to 3,916. And if you have a gun rammer, vents, brothers in arms, and pudding, so basically if you were pimping it out to the max, you would have a DPM of 4,700. Wow, that would be good actually, wouldn't it? 4,271, which is still pretty damn good. That's still pretty crazy. 4,700 would be even crazier, but that's just me not being able to speak properly. So the L1A1, it is a fantastic gun. It's got 259 average pen, 326 gold pen, but you're probably not going to need to carry that many gold shells, to be honest. The average pen on this is so good that honestly the number of targets you're going to need gold pen against, they're not going to be many. You might want, say, 2 or 3 for really critical moments in a match, but apart from that, mostly it's going to be AP. Also, it's worth noting that this thing gets HESH instead of HE ammo. That's just as regular HE ammo as HESH, so you get 120 pen with your HESH, and there are some targets where that can be quite effective, things like Waffenträgers especially. Most of the time you're not going to be using that, but still, it's there if you need it. The accuracy is 0.31, which is actually a step down from the AT-15, but only by 0.01, so it's nothing to cry about exactly. 0.31 still pretty damn good. You can hit targets from a very long distance away with that. The aim time is one of the biggest benefits of this gun. 1.7 seconds aim time. You do not need a gun laying drive. You can put one on if you want. It would be kind of crazy. In fact, we will just where are we? Put a gun laying drive on, and you can see their gun laying drive. It takes you down to, with 100% crew, less than just under 1.5 seconds. You don't need that. You really don't. It's good enough without, to be honest. The handling stats of this are so good. I mean, the gun bloom as well, when you're moving and firing, it's very good for snapshotting people. It's better to stop and fire, and because that aim time is so good, it usually pays to stop and fire. But if you've got to shoot on the move, it's not terrible for that either. It's really good. So the gun depression, the handling, I've talked about the handling a little there, but the depression, the elevation is pretty good. As you can see, the gun depression is actually 10 degrees, so this is one of the very good features about this tank. There are times and places where you can use this as a peekaboo machine. There's some drawbacks to that, and we'll touch on that in the downsides, But it's there if you need it. The possibility is there to play peekaboo with somebody, pop over, use that excellent gun handling, and just go pow right in somebody's face or back or whatever. It has, let's see, I'm just looking at my list here, 40 degrees of gun traverse, and again this is a little bit less than the AT-15, but 40 degrees is still pretty good. It does also mean that you can angle your tank to use that armor, and obviously the more you can angle, the more effective it is. But there are still significant weak spots that you're never really going to be able to angle away, unfortunately. But it does increase the effectiveness of your frontal armor and your side armor especially. The side armor on the Tortoise is pretty damn good. Lastly, in terms of the gun, you get 50 rounds of ammo, which is enough that you can afford to waste a few. It's unlikely you're going to run out in a battle, but it is in theory, I think, possible. So you want to be a little bit careful when spamming the shells, but you can. There are occasions when you can afford to waste a shell or two knocking down something, for instance. All other things to note, it gets 2,000 hit points, which is on a par with the FV183, so it gets exactly the same hit points as the tier 10. It's one of the reasons why I say this thing is basically another tier 10, except you get it with better matchmaking, and you get it earlier, and you get it cheaper, and you get it for less XP. So yeah, the British TD line basically gets 2 tier 10s, and if you're not interested in the second one, you can just stick with this one. I really like that feature. And it has 390 meters view range. I would recommend optics. You might want binos, but I think optics are probably better. In fact, we can see exactly what optics would give you. And it's a nice feature of Tank Inspector. So optics would give you 429 view range. If you had binos, when you're stopped, you would... it does take that into account. You would get, well, you'd get the max view range plus a bit of extra spotting power. So, I mean, binos might be worth playing if you're going to be... might be worth using if you're going to be playing this very passively, but I would personally take optics over binos just because they are always active, and especially if you're in situations when you're angling a lot or having to peekaboo or whatever. Optics is going to be always useful all match long, whereas binos is only going to be useful sometimes. So this is one of those tanks where you can have the choice of both, but optics is the one I'd go for. I'll transition here. I'll talk about the armor, and that takes me into the bad points as well, because the armor is a mixed bag. It is both good and bad. We'll have a very quick look at the see, because that's so close to the thing, it wiggles the barrel around when you don't want it to. The armor is in theory pretty decent, and in places it is decent. Around the gun especially, the mantlet, I mean, it's just crazy. Nothing's going to pen you there. The thing is, though, that's rather small, so people aren't often going to be hitting that. This whole side of the tank is quite a bit weaker. Well, I say quite a bit. It's still 172 mil of armor, but it is a significant area, and it is a significantly weaker area than these more orangey bits, which, as you can see, have got nearly 60 millimeters more armor. So the frontal plate here, this side of the gun, and the side armor I've touched on. I mean, the side armor only 152, and again, that's another weaker area there. But if you're angled, you can see that is yeah, that's some ricochet levels of people aren't going to pen that. So if someone hits your side at an angle, that is just going to bounce off. You've got fairly nice big tracks to eat shells as well. The upper front plate, there's this big weak patch in the front. So honestly, there's various places on the front of this where one of the hallmarks of the British AT line has been that it's well armoured, and the armour's worth a lot at tier 5, and then as you go up it gradually becomes worth less. Once you get to tier 9 it's worth the least of all, so you can be, if you were used to being very, very aggressive in your AT2, then yeah, those days are long gone. But like all the AT series, it's also got a big weak spot on the top in the form of this MG cupola. You can't angle that. There's very, very little chance anything's ever going to bounce off that. So when I was talking about peekaboo tactics before, that's one of the things that works against that. Is the first time you do it, you might have the element of surprise, you'll get in a shot. Next time you do it, they'll be waiting for you, and they'll be pre-aimed at this thing, because it'll pop over the crest of whatever bit of terrain you're using before you do, and they can plant a shot in that nicely. And sure, you've got 2,000 hit points, but for a lot of the tier 10 and even some of the tier 9s, that is like 4 hits and you're dead. So you do have to be quite cautious. There are times you can be aggressive in this, especially when you're facing off against lower tiers. But on the whole, I would say facing frontally against people is possible, but use some caution. The other downside, again, that's a hallmark of the British 80 series, the Nuffield line, is the poor mobility. It's as slow as all the rest. The top speed hasn't gotten any better. It's still 20 kilometers an hour. It's only actually got just over 10 horsepower per ton, which is not particularly great. So if you're not a fan of slow machines, well, for one thing, how have you managed to get up to the Tortoise without finding that maddening already? I don't know, but well done for your sheer blind persistence, I suppose. But that has the downside of, if you can get into position and you can get to a choke point or a strategic point on the map or whatever, then that's fine. You can lay down the fire. But if the battle starts to pass you by, and this is presuming you're on a winning team, for instance, or if a situation becomes critical on another flank, you're never going to get there in time. So early positioning is really, really important, and sometimes with the best will in the world, the battle is just going to pass you by. That is always a risk of slow tanks. This is no different. It also is, it's not just slow in going forwards and backwards, it's also fairly slow in traversing. It's a little bit better than the AT-15, which had, I think, 20. This gets 22 degrees per second. You can, of course, buff that slightly with your cruise skills. I think if you take the driver skill that enhances your turning speed, you can get an extra degree per second to just over. But it's not, it's not exactly a big jump, but it might be worth having. It's very easy to get around one of these things. But if somebody's trying to get around you, well, you've still got a decent chance of taking their tracks off. And if they've already used their repair kit, then at that point they're stuffed. So you do still have a decent chance if you're rushed by a medium, for instance, and he's coming at you frontally. But if someone gets to your side or whatever, unless you're lucky, unless you're near some terrain or a building that you can use to kind of push them off you and get them in front of your gun again, you're probably not going to do very well. You're also going to do very badly against multiple fast enemies that can just surround you and swarm, and at that point your rate of fire doesn't really count for as much, because sure, you might hit and track one, but the rest are going to get around you, at which point you're pretty much dead meat. So don't really ever go it alone in this if you can possibly help it. And if you're the last person left alive at the end of the battle, which I have been on occasion, that's not very fun if you're trying to chase down somebody in this thing. Yeah, that is not an ideal situation in any tank destroyer, and especially not this. So, just before we move on, I'm going to briefly touch on equipment and crew skills as well. I don't usually do crew skills, but I probably should in my reviews. I tend to feel it's one of these things, it's more up to people individually what they want to do, but there are certain ones that are more useful on this, so I'm gonna give it a go. So in terms of equipment, you've got actually a couple of choices. The gun rammer is an absolute essential. This is all about the DPM, it's all about that gun, and it's about getting that gun to bear and getting it into battle and flinging those shells at the enemy. The extra DPM, I've already given you the DPM figures. It jumps by, what did I say, nearly 400 DPM. So it is absolutely essential equipment, no question about it. Whatever else you have the gun rammer. You could either have optics or binos. I've already touched on that. Personally, I go for optics. And lastly, you could either have ventilation, which would give you a small but significant buff to, well, everything really, or you could do, again, what I do and accept the fact that you are in a large, slow machine, which will be picked on by artillery. So, yeah, super heavy spall liner. The downside of that is it slightly impairs your mobility, and also it's expensive. It's the super heavy one, so it's 750,000 credits. So you might not want that on the grounds of cost, but bear in mind Vents Class 3 is 600,000, so it's not that much extra. It's really a case of personal preference on that one. If you've got a crew with brothers in arms, then I think ventilation might be the way to go, because obviously that's a stackable bonus. But otherwise, I would go with super heavy. In terms of crew skills, well, brothers in arms I've mentioned. Yeah, maybe for a third crew skill, I would say repairs is very useful for this. For a either a second crew skill or a first crew skill for most of the crew, because you've got those big tracks. They're going to eat some shells, and if you can get your tank repaired ASAP, well, of course, very, very useful indeed. If you can spot the enemy before they spot you, well, that's also very, very useful. So Sixth Sense is, well, it doesn't really exactly help you spot them before they spot you, but you'll know you've been spotted. So Sixth Sense is very useful. On the Radio Man, there's which one is it? Situational awareness. Again, that's a small boost to your view range, so that's fairly useful. For the gunner, I would actually say I don't actually. I hope these are showing up, by the way, because sometimes the menus don't show up in when I'm recording Bandicam. I'm pointing at the crew skills on the thing, and it might not actually be showing it. That's just occurred to me. But Deadeye, by far the most useful crew skill for the gunner, because any tank where you've got a rapid rate of fire is it particularly benefits from that one. For the driver, I would definitely say clutch braking. A smooth ride might be useful. The rest is really up to you. I mean, there are some very, very useful driver skills, but I think those are the most two useful ones for the Torty. And for the loaders, it's basically the usual thing. So yeah, this does get 2 loaders, by the way. I should have mentioned that. Quite useful if you're desperately wanting to have the intuition perk maxed out, because you can have them both doing that or whatever. Safe stowage is always useful. I'm trying to think what else they get. I don't think there is really much else. The one that gives you the adrenaline rush might be useful if you're in a perilous situation. It might give you that extra edge. It would make your DPM even better, but that's one you're not going to be using very often. Camo is also probably a useful skill on the Torty. I would say it's one you could either train up the crew and then drop it as you're going along, or else you just say, oh, it's going to be my 3rd or 4th crew skill. I wouldn't put it on necessarily as a first crew skill, but certainly Cambo has got a place as well. So we'll do a little intermission and then we'll move on to some replays. Well, a replay, and then you can hear my conclusion on this machine. But overall, it's one of the less balanced ones. It is all about the gun, and it's about getting that gun into battle. And if you can stand the rest of the machine, if you don't mind it, then the gun can be hilarious. So just, bear that in mind. Anyway, let's have the intermission. So here we are, it's a Redshire encounter battle, and this is one from the stream. So I'm with Foch and Circon, who are both in medium tanks. Circon in the E50M and Foch in the STB1. At least I think I've got that the right way around. Yes, there we go, Circon, and there over there is Foch in his, as of recording this, newly acquired STB1. He was grinding fairly hard for that, I think. But yeah, we're not really talking about the STB1, we're talking about this thing. So they have a particular side they like to go that I know, which is the 9-0 line, which on this map, I've been talking about choke points up to now, and that definitely counts as a choke point. You can see there my ammo loadout, exactly what I was saying, 40 AP, 6 Hesh, and for, what was it, APDS? I can't remember. Basically APCR ammo, anyway. So I'm going to move to support where I know Circon and Foch are going. You can see here, I was talking about with the mobility, I mean, you can take so long to get into position, and some people will find that frustrating. Some people might really want the tier 10 and just not be enjoying the grind at all. I don't know what to
say there really what to recommend. I suppose you could always free XP your way all the way to the tier 10, but honestly I quite like this machine. So we see there the aim time. Unfortunately it's not very well aimed. I think I hit quite close to where his gun is, so that's a fairly bouncy bit of armour. But I knew he was pulling back, so I kind of rushed the shot, and sometimes you're going to do that. So I'm just going to keep trundling forward. There's also a few other tanks here. There's an Object 140, an IS-4, and a T-110E4. Now, with a more fragile tank destroyer, the inclination might be to sit a lot further back, say J0, maybe H0, where there's a bit of terrain that you can use. But I'm going to get a lot closer than that, just because I know there's a lot of friendly tanks here, and also that there's no artillery to worry about. The lack of artillery, as in any tank, just gives you more options, but in a slow tank it especially gives you more options. You just can do more on a map. So I'm going to get into a position where hopefully my side is protected by these rocks, that I'm just also low down enough that I'm not going to be hit by anything. And there we go, I know I've been spotted. I just punch through the front of the E50M turret and immediately start to angle. He fires, it bounces. So yeah, I can out DPM him all day long. I do apologise for, I know people find that annoying, and I am consciously working on it, where I zoom out immediately, just immediately after or just immediately before firing. So that is a hard habit to break, surprisingly. But hello, T-34. So I've punished the E50M a bit. He's pulled back, but there's a T-34 who thinks he's going to be able to use his gun depression to work that flank, but didn't really count on there being a Torty there. But the fact is, he's not taken that lesson to heart, so he's still going forward. That was a real snapshot. It's a pity I bounced the first one, but I think I hit his upper front plate at such an angle that it did bounce off, even with this gun. So, keeping myself angled when I'm peeking around this rock here. Not going to try that shot unless he comes up a bit, which he actually is, so into the hole there. He fires and misses. I was actually able to pull back in time. And the other one's peeking forward, so again, into the hole, bounce his shot. And this is where that angling comes in particularly useful, because they have got good guns, the T-34s, but there's enough time in between reloads that I can just pull back immediately and not really have to worry too much. So again, look, I'm just punishing these guys. I've already done 3.4k damage, and yes, okay, it's a pair of T-34s with soft hulls, but this is why I chose this replay. Just because you begin to get some idea of, in the right circumstances, just what this DPM can do. It's really crazy. So I know there's an FV there, I know there's a Yakpan's 100 over there as well, so I'm trying to use this bush here. I'm trying to make use of my optics. Oh, E4. Yes, please. So he's out the way, I back up again, don't want to get nailed inside by a tank destroyer. Well, I've just been cleaning up here. Oh, and there's an enemy waffle as well. Can I get a shot into him and then pull back? Now, he is, unfortunately... You can see there, I can see him if he backs up a bit, but he's just kind of just below. Oh, and there we go. Get a shot into his gun shield. Pull back. Now, I'm not going to... That's the kind of thing where I fire and then zoom out immediately after that, because I want to be aware of my surroundings when I pull back. So I think that's where the habit arose from, but it's gotten to a point where I fire and like pull out even before I fire. So if that's annoying to people. Anyway, lower front plate, and look at this, I'm just cleaning up. If he sits there, I'm going to have him again. He's turning again, and I knew that was a chancy shot. He was angled such that I didn't really have a particularly great shot on him, but anyway, Circle and Foch are doing really alright as well. Circle's taken a bit of a battering, but I've done over 5,000 damage, and we're only just at the 5-minute mark. I mean, this was absolutely monstrous. And there we go, there's the waffle. Finish him off. The aim time on this gun, it's just so... If you get this kind of situation where you are really providing this kind of supporting fire to a flank, I mean, it's just ridiculous. So, trying to get the FV turret, trying quite hard to not hit a part that will actually bounce. The FV turret is not particularly great, but there are bits that you hit that just will bounce. And again, just pow, able to get the kill. There's not much of the enemy team left at this point. I have I've only got, I say only 4 kills, relative to the amount of damage I've done, you know, only 4 kills. Circon's actually got 4 kills as well. He managed to pick off the other tanks that were on this flank. So we're down to the last 4 enemies, and trying for a shot, but no, if there was a shot on that back channel, it's an extremely narrow one. I try anyway. Sometimes the marker is not particularly... You might just have a shot on something and the marker doesn't actually... The outline doesn't actually tell you. But in this case, no. I've also fired half of my shells in the space of... Well, we're at the 8.5 minute mark now. I think it is easily possible to run out of shells in this game, so you do have to be a bit careful with the Torty. We see that Foch going after the Batchat. And also, this, again, illustrates perfectly what I was talking about being a bit slow once a battle has passed a certain stage. If you're on a winning team, you can just totally get left behind. And I've done over 6k damage. But I'm not going to get to do any more damage because I'm just not fast enough. So, it's hard to complain too much, but Circon and Foch were able to zoom off at the end there, pick up a bit more damage, get a last kill in the case of Foch, but the Torty is never really ever going to be able to do that unless you're facing, say, a T95 or, I don't know, some Togs. I don't know how you'd be in a battle with Togs versus a Torty, but given that some people do sometimes platoon in silly ways, I suppose it's possible. So let's take a look at the scores for that match. It was my ace tanker game, and I was a little bit surprised by that. I think I've done maybe nearly that much damage with the Torty in a game before, but possibly this was my record. It was enough that I had 1440 base XP, and that was enough on this particular week to get me ace tanker, which, you know, I'm not going to complain about. I also had a high caliber medal because I actually, for a change, when I'm in a battle with Circon or Foch, usually I don't do the most damage, usually it's those guys, but in this case it's just that monstrous DPM and the number of targets I had to choose from. Some of them admittedly weren't very tough targets, those T-34s for instance, but we can see there 22 shots fired, 19 hits, 16 pens. So with 16 pens I was able to do over 6,000 damage. And the majority of that damage I did within the first 5 minutes of the battle. So the gun, it's all about the gun. It's just, if you can get that gun into a place where you can get it to work, it's fantastic. But, as with any tank of this nature, especially any slow tank, it can be so highly situational that there are going to be matches where you're able to contribute relatively little, and that can be frustrating. I freely admit that. Not every tank is going to be fun all the time, but some tanks are way more situational than others, and I think the Torty is probably one of them. However, having said that, it's versatile enough that sometimes you generally don't want to be leading a charge into enemy whatever, but in a pinch you can, especially if you've got backup. If you're facing lower tier enemies, you can bully the heck out of them with that rate of fire, with your armor, which is still more effective against lower tiers, although there are plenty of things at tier 8 that can hurt you badly. Even tier 7s can easily pen that MG cupola, so you still have to be careful. You can't go totally gung-ho in the way that you could in a mouse, for instance. But it's possible, under the right circumstances. And so much of this tank is really down to judgment. It's calling a situation, and if you call it right, then you can have a good time. You can do a lot of damage. You can make a decent amount of credits. You can get a decent amount of XP, but there are other times when it's just going to be, really frustrating. So, the Torty, I like it. I think that it is a very, very capable tank destroyer. Doesn't really prepare you in any way for the tier 10 that comes after it, but as I've said, it's practically a tier 10 in its own right. So, if you're like me and you initially went into the British AT line with the Torty as your actual end goal, I don't think you'll be disappointed, especially if you enjoyed the ones that came before it. If you've gone in with the FV as your end goal, then you might have a different experience, but honestly I still don't think it's a bad grind through the line as a whole. And the Tortoise especially, it can just do so much under the right circumstances that I certainly think it's one of the most interesting tier 9 tank destroyers. It's certainly not the hardest hitting, it's certainly not the most well armoured, it's certainly not the fastest, but oh boy, that DPM and that gun, it's just, when it works, it so works. It really does. So, if you enjoyed this review, you can hit the like button. You can leave a comment below correcting me on anything you feel I may have gotten wrong, any important points I may have missed out. Sometimes I do. You can subscribe to my channel, you can check out my other reviews, you can check out my Facebook page, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.